Okay, can you hear me, Bill?
I can just barely hear you. Not
Okay,
satisfactory at all.
how about now?
Uh, Still just barely. I can hear you, but not very well.
Okay,
Am I
well,
clear?
yeah, you're clear, and we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll clean it up on the run, okay? So,
Sounds good.
with that being said,
This is Professor Robert D'Agostino with Do Facts Matter. And today I have a guest, and the guest is Will Harris. Now, Will Harris, interesting fella. I've known Will Harris for, I don't know, 50 years, Bill. You think so, Will?
Since about 1964.
Yeah, and fact of the matter is, Will Harris was a student of mine when I taught high school while I was in law school at Emory at night. So I was a night student at Emory when Emory had a night law school, and Will Harris was one of my students in my general science and then biology class. And I would have to say about Will, he wasn't that good a student, but that didn't take away from the fact that he's a pretty creative guy. And we'll find out how creative shortly. Will, tell the audience a little bit about yourself. I know that you, for a long time, ran Harris Design Build, which did really high-class renovations. I was honored to be your guest in Hilton Head in a house that you renovated, and it was just superb. I mean, really, I think all you can say was a class act. I know you... when that house was bought, it was you tore it down to the frame and rebuilt it. So Harris Design Build for years. But before that, Will had a lot more interesting things going for him. Who'd you work for before that, Bill? Will, I should say. I know I shouldn't call you Bill because you don't like Bill Clinton, so you changed your name from Bill to Will. So I knew you as Bill Harris, and now you're Will Harris. By the way, just to tell the audience, I was very fond of Will's parents, Malcolm and Frances, and the reason I was very fond of them, the first reason, although they were nice people, is that I was an impecunious law student with very little money, and they would invite me over for dinners every so often, and a free dinner, man, that was worth its weight in gold. Will, go ahead, tell us about you.
Well, as I remember, you could eat quite a bit at that time. The way you liked ice cream was very interesting. We got where we would just give you a half gallon of Breyers, and you would make it disappear.
Well, that's when you had the 2 bananas in there, too, to wash it down.
Yeah, and some chocolate syrup. My mother was very fond of you. There was a humorous story where, if you've never seen Bob, he's a tall, handsome man, and we had told my sisters, one of which is much older, probably your age, that I had a teacher coming, and they thought la-di-da, and then I remember my sister saying, they opened the door, and in walks this guy, and my sister went running to go make herself up to look more presentable.
Yes.
But from that point on, it was quite a strange time. I remember being pulled out of grammar school, and I now realize what a poor job our government schools are doing, because they had pulled me out and had my IQ tested because I was doing poorly in school, but on the California Achievement Test, I was college level vocabulary, college level math, all that, and they couldn't understand why I couldn't do third grade work. But it all went on. Years later, I ended up going to Germany to work. I had a deal to work in Africa on infrastructure projects in Kenya with Matushka Corporation, which is one of the children of the BMW Varta battery legacy. And I had a very interesting time there. Ended up having to run for our lives because we were just a few hundred kilometers away from where they were cutting our soldiers up and dragging them through the streets. And
that's in Somalia. Will, that was in Somalia, right?
Yeah, they were in Somalia. I was in Kenya. It was right next door.
Yes, and that's where President Clinton refused to rescue our
He
troops.
wouldn't roll the tank.
Yes, he wouldn't, and he could have rescued them and refused to do so. I remember that. Yes.
Yeah, well, it caused quite a bit of disturbance, and that was one of the first things that led me to a life of conservatism. And seems like I've been fighting communism and socialism and these same people my whole life that are very powerful in our country today. They have control of the media, they have control of the schools, they have control of Hollywood, and they're influencing people at a frightening rate.
Will, tell us about some of the countries you've been in besides Kenya. I guess you flew into Kenya on some projects. What other countries? By the way, Will is a very good pilot, private plane. Many years ago, he took me, when I lived in New Jersey, he took me and my son on a trip. We flew over the house I then lived in, much to my wife's, she got very excited about it, let's just say.
She wasn't happy.
No, she wasn't happy about me flying around with my son in a private plane piloted by Will Harris. But in any case, tell us what other countries you've been in, and give us some insight, some in your impression of these countries. What was your impression of Kenya? Kenya's been one of the so-called shining lights of Africa.
Well, at that time when they opened the door of the plane in Mombasa, the smell would hit you in the face. And if you look at Mombasa, you'll see it lays in a valley right on the Arabian Ocean, and all around it is a ridge line where the poor people live up there, and the people, more wealthy people, or the people with money at all, live in the city. And at that time, they had no sewage, and the people that lived on the ridge would just take their little pot every morning and throw it out in the street, and it all washed down into Kenya. So what we were trying to do was put in sewage pipes to get that cleaned up, and it was really helping the people. But of course, they came and tried to kill us later, so it's a very typical situation for what happens when you try and improve things. Kenya was very interesting, but even more interesting, I think, was when I worked in China. We were some of the first people to get there after the communism opened up a little bit. And they had it where you had to be invited, you had to have a project, and you had guides that would go with you everywhere. So they tried to steer you towards the part of the town where there were American hotels, and it was somewhat Europeanized. And I would always walk out and start walking into the other areas of town, and the little guys that were supposed to be escorting me would get all upset. And I can remember walking past all these places that had, the blinds would always be closed, but outside there were all kinds of aquariums and cages with all sorts of animals. And I thought, why do they have so many pet shops in this place? There's, the people live in relative poverty, but they have all these pet shops. And then one of the times I just walked up the steps and opened the door, and it was all tables, and I realized this was a restaurant, and you picked your meal out of the aquarium, which was that had a profound effect on me. I realized how people in the rest of the world live and how their cultures work. You would see people in a country where a lot of people are starving, and they would have their bowl of noodles, eating it in the street, and then when they got done, they would just throw the rest down in the gutter. And I realized that was part of a way of showing affluence, if you could waste food. The same in India. I had a lot of Sikh friends in India that we talked a lot about how the Sikh religion got started. And they were very vocal about it. The Sikhs were started because someone that's better in history will have to refresh my memory, but it's either the 8th century or the 12th century when Islam was created. And the Muslims would come across to India, and they had something they did called conquering from within your own skin that they talked to me about, and that's where the Sikh religion was founded. The Sikhs were created to protect the Hindus, And what they would do is they would go in a village and they'd kill all the men and most of the children. They'd take the women back.
Wait a
to
minute.
Africa.
Who would kill the? Wait, it's not clear. Who would kill the men and take the children and women? Are you talking about the Muslims? Yes. Right. Go ahead.
They would come across. They'd kill everyone in a village. They'd take the women, take them back to Africa, and then marry with them and convert them to Islam and raise the children in Islam, and then take them back and reinstate them in the village. At this point, full-fledged Muslims, and that's how Islam got a start in India, and that's where the Sikh religion started.
So the Sikhs were part of the Hindu religion.
Yes, the Sikhs came out
right.
of Hinduism, and they were created because part of the Hindu religion was just, you just let them kill you. And the Sikhs would fight, and they became they're still the Sikh watch to this day. And when India had problems in the north, Indira Gandhi would always call out the Sikh watch, and they'd go out there and stomp it out real quick. They're to this day, when I see a Sikh, New York, a lot of them own hotels. When I see a Sikh, and they're immediately identifiable because they always have a turban. They don't cut their hair or their beard. They have, I believe, 5 things they always carry. They have a copper band around a wrist. They have extra underwear, and they always have a dagger. And to this day, you'll find that they still do that. But whenever I see a Sikh, I know that's someone you can do business with, and they'll be straight. They'll be hard, but they'll be very good.
So you've had experience in India, China, Kenya. Where else?
A little bit in South America. That was in Brazil. And then I also did work with product placement in some of the communist countries right after the wall fell, getting American products there. Varta Batteries was one. Product called Quorn, Quorn, various things, bringing Western products into these countries and researching and see if they're going to work, which was, again, part of the in-depth relationship I've had with communism and seeing the effects of it. It's absolutely brutal what happens. What happens to the psyche of the people is even more frightening to me, is what it does to their life, because everyone's poor in socialism. They, our current crop of people here think that if we go socialist, everybody's going to have an iPhone and a Mercedes and a flat screen TV, and they don't realize that the truth is actually everyone has nothing and everyone's the same.
Well, that's not really true. The ruling class always does well in a socialist system. Remember the Soviet Union, the Communist Party leadership had these dakas, or these vacation homes on the Black Sea. And in Cuba, if you want medical treatment, you can't get it unless you're a member of the Communist Party leadership or a foreigner. So
Maduro, when he died, he had billions of dollars, even though the people were starving.
Yes.
When I was working a little bit in the northern part of Europe, Poland, in that area, there's a little island called Rugen, Rugen, and the Russian politicians had a place there they called the Beach Hotel.
Okay, hold that thought. We're in a hard break. We'll be right back with Will Harris and Do Facts Matter.
Perhaps you are struggling to cope with the disease of addiction. If not, you probably know a family member or friend that needs help in battling the cravings and the personal and professional damage done by the effects of drugs or alcohol. Get a pen and paper and be ready to write down the following. These are the issues that the trained staff at the Atlanta Healing Center address and treat every day. Their doctors and counselors with over 40 years of practice in the field of addiction can treat the suffering individual in a thoughtful, compassionate, and experienced manner and guide him or her along the path to recovery. So call 770-696-9862 and speak to a knowledgeable staff member about how you or your loved one can be helped to enjoy a better and healthier life. More information is also available on the website at www.atlantahealingcenter.com.
If your health insurance premium is more than your mortgage, Ellen Deal with Ideal Solutions is here to help. Whether you're a small business owner, individual, family, or baby boomer, email maga45cag@gmail.com and I'll respond with 3 easy questions to help you determine if you can get away from Obamacare. As a 20-year veteran of the insurance industry, I'm here to help with all your insurance needs. Email Ellen Deal at maga45cag@gmail.com.
Whether cruising the strip in a 57 Chevy or taking the family on a vacation in a 71 Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser, you need to tune in to Classic Cars with Steve Ronaldo and Jim Weber every Saturday from 8 to 9 a.m. on americaswebradio.com.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the americasbroadcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
This is Professor Robert D'Agostino back with Do Facts Matter, and my guest is Will Harris. Will Harris, a longtime acquaintance and a longtime friend, actually. In fact, the matter is, I taught him in high school, way back when I taught high school while going to Emory Law School at night. And Will has made quite an adventuresome life out of his, which is what a surprise. You know, he was always intelligent and creative, but as a student, he wasn't much. But you did get a degree in Germany, but tell us where you were going with just before the break. Will, take it over.
I was talking about Rugen, how, Russia, and this was in the late 80s, early 90s, and, Russia was not doing very well. They had a way of measuring output by tonnage, so they'd make tractors with iron wheels and things like that didn't work very well, but the beach hotel in Rugen was what I was talking about, where we were talking about where the people are starving, but the party people live a life that's hard to imagine. And they had this place called the Beach Hotel you could only access by an elevator that went down a steep cliff, and then it was on a beach down in a little, at the bottom of the cliff, and you couldn't get there anyway except by boat, which you'd get shot, or by that elevator where you had to be let in. And what I've seen all around the world where these countries with the oppressive regimes, the party members live a life that's, not that distant from what I see Nancy Pelosi, where her G4 is not enough for her. She had to have her own private 757 to fly her back and forth. And it was the same then. The comparisons between what's going on in America today. For example, an opinion I have very strongly is that we are in the same place Europe was in 1933, only this time we're Germany, and Hitler got elected, and what happened. So the last few elections have been a turning point, just as it was for Germany. Interestingly enough, when I was based in Germany, I used to wonder, how can these people, they seem so nice and friendly, how could they have done this? And I really studied it a lot. I read Mein Kampf in German. I read, a very interesting read is Karl Marx in the original German. The translations we get here have been softened up. The Schwangarbeit and things like that have been taken out, where they talk about the bourgeois eventually revolting and refusing to work, and that, you have to do something to get them to continue working. And that always, of course, was kill them.
Or send them to the gulags.
Yeah.
When Stalin needed workers to build trenches and to build a subway in Moscow, he just arrested lots of people, and after they finished the work, he sent them to the gulag, where they did other work or starved to death.
Yeah, until they died.
Yes.
That's how my father's family ended up getting here. They were something called kulaks, not gulag, but kulaks, which were people with somewhat of an education and that owned land. And, of course, the same state where we are with socialism in America, that private property rights have to go. So people that were smart enough to figure out what was going on got out, and the rest of the people were killed, and either way you lost your land. And that's also my opinion And if you read Karl Marx very much at all, you'll see the next thing on their agenda is private property rights, which they attack by increasing property taxes to an unsustainable point, which is in many states, especially the blue states, property taxes are almost unsustainable. Only the wealthiest can afford it. So everything ends up, in the long run, it ends up going to either big business or the government.
But of course, on the property taxes in the blue states, on the wealthy, one reason they hate Trump so much, the wealthy, is because under the Trump tax bill, they couldn't write off all their property taxes, their high taxes in the blue states, against federal taxes. There was a limitation of $10,000. So these who were paying $25,000, $30,000, $40,000 in property taxes and writing them off against federal taxes, they got really annoyed because the Trump tax bill resulted in a tax increase for them, even though the percentage was supposedly reduced, but the deductions were changed, and that really infuriated them.
That's another way that the big lie of the left, that they're for the middle class, they invariably, the way they had it set up was you could deduct your property tax against your federal tax, which ended up putting the burden on the middle class, if you think that through very far at all.
It also put the burden on the red states that were effectively subsidizing the blue states' tax policies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's another point that's a really good one to make, is that how the left says they're for the middle class, and yet I've used that argument. Whenever you argue or try to discuss with a liberal, whenever you get them to raise their volume and shout you down, you know that you effectively won. And they'll always do that. Like, they'll always say, those evil oil companies, we have to tax the oil companies mercilessly. They're evil. And then I always say, well, do you think the oil companies just pay the tax and just say, okay, we won't make any profit for our shareholders who are also retirees and all those people? And they say, well, they should. And I say, well, they don't. They raise the price of tax. So then your big tax increase on the oil companies, a tax on the weakest of the weak. The people that are struggling to get a tank of gas to go to work are the ones that are paying that. And that's the point where their volume goes up and they start shouting and don't hear a word you say. But almost invariably, if you look very deeply into the left policies, it always ends up on the back of the poor.
I think that's quite true. I don't think there's any question about it if you analyze things, but of course people don't analyze anything. I was talking. I bought a new television recently because my other television, I guess, start flashing white and black. It died, so I went to Best Buy and I looked around. I was looking at several places and I found a television set eventually that I wanted to buy. And I was talking to a very intelligent fella who was the sales consultant, as I like to call him. And he was obviously intelligent. He had some education, or he had some credentials. I hate to say education because a lot of people have credentials, they're not educated. And so I asked him a question. We were talking. I said, let me ask you a question. The ultra rich, I'm people with multiple billions of dollars. Take the top 10. How many of them, and I'll give you a hint, the last time I looked, 9 out of 10 of the top ultra wealthy people in this country were in one political party. Which party do you think that was? Oh, it's the Republicans. They represent the wealthy. Wrong. Democrats. And the Democrats are the party of what I call mostly the non-productive affluent, government bureaucrats, people who make their money making motion pictures in Hollywood, social workers, people who are associate deans for diversity and inclusion at the major universities. None of these people really are particularly productive or productive at all, but they are, and they're all Democrats. Now, the only exception probably to that is some of the tech people for I think cultural reasons, they favor the Democrats, which I kind of find interesting because some of them do very productive work. But look at lawyers. Tort lawyers are Democrats. Transactional lawyers are Republicans. Transactional lawyers help businesses operate and put deals together. Tort lawyers, their economic result of tort claims is a transfer of wealth from productive to non-productive, usually themselves. I'm not criticizing people should be paid for their injuries, but the answer is economically that's a transfer of wealth from productive to non-productive sources. Well, tell us about the countries and what you see happening to America as you've been around the world. You've seen these socialist regimes. You've seen these corporate capitalist regimes. Where the big corporations run the country in cahoots with the government and the big unions, which I think is happening here. But what do you think?
The unions are, I think if Samuel Gompers saw what's happened to the unions today, he would certainly be rolling over in his grave. The unions have been, I think they're a devastating effect here. There's nothing that they do that's not covered by federal or local law anymore other than collective bargaining, which is their big argument. And again, the argument I use there is, well, if you make, it's what I saw in Germany, for example. Everybody makes good money. They have 5 weeks a year vacation, but a box of Cheerios costs $12 and a gallon of gas is $6. So when you pay people an exorbitant salary, but you inflate the cost of everything within a company, they actually had a better life when they made $12 an hour and a gallon of gas was $1 than they do when they make $30 an hour and a gallon of gas is $6.
Well, don't you think there's a division between the public service unions and the private unions? The private unions are losing membership rapidly. The public service unions, of course, have nobody to really negotiate with because they negotiate with politicians, and politicians want the vote.
They negotiate with themselves.
Right.
If you look at Detroit as a prime example of that, they negotiated with themselves for years. In the 1950s, Detroit was the Hollywood of America. It had one of the highest standards of living in the country. It was a beautiful, gorgeous city, and 50 years of Democrat rule and union rule, and you look at what happened to Detroit. Classic example.
Well,
the public sector unions
right.
are negotiating with themselves.
Yes.
In end effect.
Okay, of all the countries, and we'll get on to what you're up to now, of all the countries that you have visited, and there are quite a few, give us your projection about what's going to happen. Not only here, but in Kenya and China. I mean, China looks like they're going backwards into strict communism. India.
Well, Russia does too. Putin has done no good for Russia. He's actually set them back. If you remember when communism fell with Reagan in Russia, they had a huge influx of crime where they had their own mafia and people made ridiculous fortunes. And I'm not one that says ridiculous fortunes easily. There's a part of the brainwashing, the subtle brainwashes, are things like filthy rich, like it's dirty to be rich. But they made so much money by not doing anything that benefits anyone other than themselves. I really believe that any commercial enterprise needs to have a synergy where the people that you serve, the people, that everyone gets something. It's not just for you. And all these countries, the same thing happened. China's going backwards right now, although Iran and China, I think there's a high probability that there will be uprisings in these countries. I know the Iranian people, as a generalization, and generalizations being generally true, but the Iranian people are actually very nice, good people, and they have a boot on their throat right now. And I think a lot of them are tired, and I think China is realizing what's going on there. Xiaoping is not doing anyone favors except the party.
Okay, hold that thought. We're up against a hard break. We'll be right back with Will Harris and his observations of what's going on in China.
The disease of addiction is a life-altering challenge, not just for the person suffering its effects, but
Well,
also
this
for
is
the
David
family
Moxley.
and friends who support
While you were
and
in
love
Russia,
the one
did you ever
caught in
know
its grasp.
a gentleman? He was
What
with
should be
Homeland
the course of
Security and
treatment?
was stationed in
Who is
Russia
the best person to
for a
render
number of
treatment?
years.
And what is the best
Special
place to
Agent
go
Sandy
for the care
Bostic.
that is needed? We know that
Bostic?
you want answers to
Bostic.
these
B-O-S-T-I-C.
and many more
Bostic,
questions.
like the
Call
stapler?
770-696-9862
Yeah, like
and speak to
they
a
make spray
representative
guns and
of
Right,
the
right.
Atlanta Healing
He-
Center.
He does a
They
show
can
for
tailor
us.
a program
And
specifically
quite interesting.
Really
designed
rings
to
a
address the
bell,
needs
but
of the
I don't
person
remember,
suffering with an addiction, or give you guidance
I
as to
don't
where
remember.
that
I
help
don't
may
have
be
a face
found.
with it, but the name
Information
sounds very
is the key,
familiar.
and the
There
trained
were a
staff
lot-
at DHC
at that
is
time,
here
there
to
were a lot
assist.
of American
If you
CIA
wish,
there
you
that
can
were
also
yeah.
get more information on the
doing other
website
things
located
that
at
you didn't know who they were. Everyone I've ever been around in my
www.atlantahealingcenter.com.
life that was really a spy,
Want to
you would
give
think
your
they're a
family
little
or loved
banker.
one the
You'd never
perfect
guess it.
gift?
He was
Then go
he was there
online and
when
check out
Trump did the
tornadobodydryer.com. I love
Miss
mine,
Universe.
and the warm heat air
I
massage
think that was
it
way
gives
after
me
my time.
after
I was
my
there
shower.
in like
The Tornado
91,
Body
92,
Dryer
93,
is super.
right in that area.
You'll love it, and you'll
I
love
think that
having
was
one
much
in
later, if I'm
your
not
shower.
mistaken.
Alrighty. Well,
It was still just recovery. St. Petersburg
Whether
looked
cruising
like
the strip in a
something.
57 Chevy
It,
or taking the
it's been
family
built
on a
back
vacation
now.
in a
I'm
71
not
Oldsmobile Vista
sure. I
Cruiser,
haven't been
you
there
need
a
to
long
tune in
time.
to Classic
Okay, we'll be
Cars
coming back
with Steve
shortly,
Ronaldo
so,
and Jim
okay.
Weber.
I may give you a
every
call
Saturday
later if
from
you don't
8 to
mind.
9 a.m.
That'd be
on
fine.
AmericasWebRadio.com.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
This is Professor Robert D'Agostino, back with Do Facts Matter. I'm a professor at Atlanta's John Marshall Law School, and I have my guest today is Will Harris. Will Harris was a student of mine, as I said before, when I taught high school, and he's talking right now about his observations of what's going on in China, a place where he spent some time in the past. Bill, go ahead. Will, I should say Will. I know you changed your name. Will.
Will, it's fine. I honestly believe, China did that once before in the square there where the one person stood down a tank. The Chinese people are a ballsy people, and I think they're going to get to a point where they've had enough. And these days, communication is so much better that people all over China know what's going on in China, whereas before the government could suppress it quite easily. I would not be surprised if there was an uprising and a political upheaval there, particularly with what appears to have gone on with the COVID. I'm not going to speculate on it, but I will guarantee you that there's foul play there of some sort. I'm not going to try to guess what. Everyone has their own theory, but they certainly seem to have been in cahoots with the World Health Organization. The leader of the World Health Organization, now that he's come under a little bit of scrutiny, appears to have been possibly affiliated with Boko Haram or certainly with a lot of terrorists in Africa. Not a nice guy, and they certainly seem to have helped to facilitate misinformation or lack of information getting out about the COVID virus, which could have potentially mitigated the effects worldwide. It's very interesting that if you look at America, why we had so many deaths, and it's not just because of population. I think it has to do with population density to a certain effect, but it's just very curious to me, and I think this all bears some looking into on a very detailed level. But in China, I would not be surprised at all if there was not some sort of, Ping is president for life, I think is his title, is it not?
Well, he's arranged to be president for life. I don't know if he calls himself that yet, but he's certainly arranged. He's changed the rules to some people refer him as to the new Mao Zedong.
Yeah, well, Mao didn't do anybody any favors. They had their, what did they call it, the winter of discontent, where they personally basically starved, what was it, 40 million, 60 million, huge an enormous amount of people.
Right, between the Great Leap Forward, massive starvation,
Great Leap Forward,
and then later the Cultural Revolution. But the Great Leap Forward was massive starvation. Cannibalism really was a tremendous shock to the Chinese. But they, Mao survived it.
He did, and I think it was basically because everyone that opposed him had a gun in their face very quickly.
Yeah. Well, that seems to be what Putin is doing in Russia too.
Wouldn't surprise me. I don't know. I haven't been there in close to 30 years, so I couldn't tell you. I don't have a lot of contact with very many Russians, and the ones I do have contact with seem to be somewhat closed-mouthed about it. I had one of them tell me their comment about Putin was that he was very bad for business.
Right.
So that kind of tells it all right there.
We'll talk about bad for business. What about China and Hong Kong? I mean, if you think China may be a little unstable, Xi is busy cracking down on what freedoms Hong Kong has left.
Well, I was in Hong Kong right before the transfer, and there were people there that were deathly afraid of it, and there were people there that thought it was going to be the best thing ever. I think they found out now that the former was the end result. Same Taiwan is going to be, there's still problems to be coming in Taiwan.
Do you think China will move against Taiwan?
I think when the time is right. The interesting thing you have to look at is Trump was obviously hated by the American left, and the American left is closely affiliated with groups like the CDC and the World Health Organization. And what Trump had done with China, while was absolutely wonderful for America, put back imbalances that have been in place, really started ever since Nixon opened China up. Every liberal president since then has pretty much given them keys to the bank in America more and more and more. And Trump, in end effect, took away a lot of that. So if you look at that and think, well, China's going to be mad. They want to get rid of Trump. The left wants to get rid of Trump. And then all of a sudden this virus pops up out of a lab that supposedly researches these things. Some of the coincidences are, have you ever heard of Occam's razor?
Well, of course.
Yeah, well, if you apply Occam's razor to this, you could come up with an interesting theory about what's really going on. But to me, the way this whole situation here has denigrated itself, it seems to be, at this point, it's a get Trump scheme from one end to the other. And all these Democrat governors doing all this to kill small business. In my opinion, the Democrats always want to kill small business because then the large businesses take over that market share. And the large businesses they can control. It's very difficult to control 1 or 2 million small businesses, whereas a big business is very easy for them to control. So all this is just a little too convenient for me. I have I would say paranoia, but certainly I would say a distrust of a lot of the powers that be. And that's on both sides of the aisle.
Well, I think you're right, Bill. I think one theory is, of course, that the virus was developed at the Wuhan lab from other viruses. This particular virus has a particularly affinity for humans, which is kind of unusual, that it accidentally escaped from the lab, and then the Chinese government saw the potential of that virus to wreck the economies of Western nations. So I think probably the initial escape was an accident, but it's hard to explain why the Chinese government completely shut down Wuhan and Hubei province, wouldn't let the Chinese out or in. If you lived in those Hubei or Wuhan, you couldn't leave to other parts of China. At the same time they locked it down, they allowed Chinese from Wuhan to travel the entire world. Now,
Absolutely.
why would you do that unless you wanted to spread the virus?
Absolutely.
So
And
it's,
they, if I'm not mistaken, they had soldiers with guns outside of people's houses. If you tried to go out, you'd get shot.
Yep.
And I heard a lot of stories that kind of quieted down. I don't know if there's any truth to it. Maybe someone out there would research it or have provable information, but it seemed like a lot of doctors disappeared in that time, too.
That's true. No, that's been demonstrated that a number of doctors have suddenly disappeared, so far not to be seen again. And so it's a very interesting situation. Of course, the Democrats are as happy as they can be because they're in a win-win situation. If there's a depression, they win, and they would love to have a depression. If they don't have a depression, and then they can blame any deaths on Trump. So either way, they win. Oh, well, you got the economy going, but look at all the people you killed. And they'll say you killed. They would just, talk about
They
Trump.
already are saying he killed these people.
Right.
Another interesting point about all this is it has effectively, I won't say emptied the nursing homes, but it certainly lowered the populations. And Democrats, let me tell you and America that the eugenics movement is alive and well. The movement that was founded by Margaret Sanger, who also founded Planned Parenthood.
Well, she didn't found the movement, the eugenics movement. She was part of it, and she founded Planned Parenthood. That's true.
Well, to me, a lot of these Democrats, Como in New York, for example, thousands of people from the nursing homes, and everyone that's in a nursing home is costing the government. They're getting their Social Security, they're getting their Medicare, they're a huge cost. And to me, they're getting back what they put in their entire life without interest, and most people are lucky if they even get the principal they put in during their entire life. But when they eliminate them, they see that as cash in the bank in end effect for them. They get to spend the money buying votes, or what they usually do with money, their pet projects. Another point is that when the Democrat House of Representatives, I would like for someone out there to tell me what is the difference when they hold the workers of America hostage for a period of time where they craft a bill with hundreds of millions of dollars for their pet projects, including, I believe, a 28% pay raise for themselves. What is the difference in that and looting in a disaster?
Well, that's a good point, and that brings up the most recent. Well, I guess you might want to call it a shopping opportunity in Minnesota, where the left is calling these riots protests. They're not protests; they're riots. They're looters and riots. What has looting got to do with protesting?
Well, they're actually busing thugs in from other towns to participate in what they call protest. It's clearly riots, and again, their cohorts in the media have whipped these flames up. To me, we have a clear case, and again, I'd like to see what went on. I have to hear more before I'm going to say anything, but it does appear to be at minimum police brutality. But there was one Asian in that group. It's hard to call it racism to me. It could be police brutality, probably is.
Okay, hold that thought. We're up against the hard break. We'll continue this discussion of the so-called protests right after the break.
Get your pen and paper ready. If there's a move in your near future, I'm here to tell you that the folks I used and now recommend is Around Town Movers. Timothy and the guys recently moved me, and I am and was totally satisfied with a sometimes not so fun experience moving. Call Timothy at 770-378-4708 and make it a good move and a good experience. Around Town Movers for that local or cross-country move. Timothy, Around Town Movers, in my opinion, are the best. That's Around Town Movers. Call them.
You can keep your doctor, you can keep your plan, and every family will save thousands of dollars a year. I'm Ellen Deal, and if you've been hurt by the Affordable Care Act, you can email MAGA45CAG@gmail.com to see if we can help. Small business owners, individuals, families, and baby boomers, email MAGA45CAG@gmail.com for 3 easy questions to determine if you can get away from Obamacare. I'm a 20-year veteran of the insurance industry and here to help you for all your insurance needs.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
This is Professor Robert D'Agostino back with Do Facts Matter and my guest, William Harris. We were talking about the so-called protests, the looting, really, that's going on in Minnesota and Minneapolis particularly, and seems to be spreading to other cities, at least cities that are controlled by Democrats who seem to not want to do anything about it. It brings up an interesting observation of Antonio Gramsci. Now, he didn't really talk about it in this way, but his followers did, the long march through the institutions. So one of the things the left is determined to do is ruin the faith of the people in the institutions, and those institutions include the family, include the free market, include the church, and they seem to be succeeding. Will, take it away.
Well, the church is clear. You know, when all this big socialist movement started, the first thing you have to do is do away with family and religion. And the way they knew to attack the family, you had to corrupt the women. And this all came about right as we got the birth control pill, and that's why it's so important to them that they determine abortion, for example, is health care and a right. And if that doesn't require too much cognizant thought to realize that it's not a right, it's not health care, it's something else totally different at all, but they never...
Well, wait a minute, Bill. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg pointed out, abortion gets rid of members of a population we want fewer of. That's what she said. New York Times interview. If you look it up, those of you who are listening, that's what she said. Abortion is a good way, population control, plus it's a good way to get rid of members of a population you want fewer of.
Well, that's the same thing Margaret Sanger said. That's the most racist thing I've ever heard, but it comes from her mouth, so she can say it. If Donald Trump or someone said that, it would be, everyday news for weeks on end. They get to say things like that, and there was a book called Freakonomics many years ago that determined that Bill Clinton took credit for crime reduction in America, but if you look, that when he was in office and when he was claiming this crime reduction was a long enough period after Roe v. Wade that all these babies that would have been born that would have been doing the crime weren't born, so the crime wasn't happening, and he was taking credit for the reduction in crime that came actually from certain people not being born and having a chance.
Well, that was the Freakonomics. That was the theory of Freakonomics. There were some other people who said, well, it wasn't quite that, because there was a movement all across the country led by Republicans to control crime. Giuliani in New York was a great example of someone who came along and really did the job by cracking down on petty crime and getting guns off the streets that were in the hands of criminals. You reduce crime everywhere. So that was a big, people have analyzed that, and that was a big reason for the decrease in crimes. The enforcement of laws like petty crimes, the enforcement, now that's been reversed, obviously. And so,
obviously.
Well, look, what's the most dangerous city per capita in the country today? It's Baltimore. Since
Maryland.
Yes, the police have been ordered to stand down because they are naughty things that happened in Baltimore with this thug that died in custody. And same thing in Ferguson. What's happened in Ferguson? I mean, this guy was a thug. Brown was a complete thug. And police have been ordered to stand down. So per capita murders in Baltimore and in Ferguson and St. Louis area have gone sky high. The per capita murder rate in both those cities exceeds Chicago's. Chicago is the murder capital in the number of murders, but not in the per capita number of murders. So,
well, that makes perfect sense.
So,
and something I've noticed, this man that was killed in Georgia recently, and they did the same thing with Brown in Ferguson. They show the picture of him. They always showed his high school graduation picture with him all nice and clean and neat in a tuxedo, instead of showing the mug shot. And they did the same thing with this guy that was killed in Georgia. They showed his graduation picture and not the mug shots of him. And not to say that any of that was correct, although Brown was correct. He was attacking an officer. He was trying to get his gun from him. He didn't succeed. He ran and he got shot. That's completely, and there were black witnesses that corroborated that. This thing in Georgia, I don't know yet what went on, but until the facts come out and it's been investigated thoroughly, I'm not going to say. But it is a typical trick of the media that if they want someone if they want to investigate what's going on in Minneapolis right there, they show a nice, neat, young picture of them when they were all young and before they got whatever happened to him. And I don't know anything about the guy in Georgia, if he was a nice guy or he was a thug. I do not know. But the one in Ferguson was clearly a thug. He had just robbed a convenience store. And when a cop tells you stop, you stop. He charged the cop, tried to wrestle him for his gun. If you do that and you get shot, I have a hard time with complaining about that. The cop was defending himself, period.
Well, let me just, this is not directly on point, but in Georgia, the situation is being investigated by the GBI. Now, the GBI in Georgia is extremely capable, extremely professional, and we had some left-wing reporter called up a few people who have worked here in Georgia, one who worked with the GBI, and it was a well-known defense attorney, criminal defense attorney, who would not say to this left-wing reporter how professional and how able the GBI is, and his confidence in the GBI in doing a thorough investigation of the incident in Brunswick, Georgia. And she didn't like that. So she went and found someone who doesn't work and didn't work with the GBI to give her a big interview about how racist everything was in Georgia and how racist the GBI was and how terrible it was. Well, the professor who gave that particular interview doesn't know a darn thing. The professor who gave the interview that said the GBI is first-class operation spent years working with them and sometimes against them. He was a very well-known defense attorney. I don't want to put the names of both of them out there, but it shows you the left will phony up anything to make an ideological point. And that's your point that you were just making. To make an ideological point, they'll even put pictures of high school graduates instead of the pictures of their more current activities being thugs. And now we're seeing the same thing in Minneapolis. We have all these wonderful protesters. Oh, well, wait a minute, that showed a picture to one of these left-wing professors at Princeton of a guy trying to break into a safe at a store to get the money out, and he's excusing that guy. He's excusing it. Insofar as it's what happens is being excused as a justifiable reaction, it is despicable. And one of the good things about Atlanta is the city of Atlanta, it's Democrat controlled, but it's controlled by Democrats who know where their bread is buttered and where the people of Atlanta's bread is buttered. Ever since Maynard Jackson came into power and got all the people in Atlanta, all the big businessmen of Atlanta together, all these white folks who were running Atlanta economically, and he said to them, essentially what he said to them is, we got the votes, you got the money. We'll let you have the votes, we'll make sure the votes go the right way, and you have stability, but we want in on the money. So Atlanta became a very good city for black entrepreneurs, for black businessmen, and a lot of that goes to Maynard Jackson, who was I know.
Well, a lot of that goes back to Lyndon Johnson too. I mean, he basically gave Atlanta over at that time, and it would always become exactly what it's become. And there's a lot of positivity to it, especially.
What?
I mean, I am all for the black community growing.
Wait. What did Lyndon Johnson do that was positive? Most of what he did was terrible effect on the black community. He wrecked the black family.
Well, they actually had government-paid people going out in the black communities telling the women, if you get rid of your husband, you'll make more money.
Well, that's right. It was. I'm talking about Maynard Jackson was a very positive influence on Atlanta.
Maynard Jackson was instrumental in Atlanta becoming what it is, where it is a place where black entrepreneurs go.
Right.
Everything from music, there's all kinds of them doing it, and they're doing well.
Yeah, but Lyndon Johnson's policies, Great Society, I can do an analysis of that, was a disaster for the black community, complete disaster.
Well, it was designed to be.
Well, that's possible.
The famous quote that is supposedly out there floating around on tape somewhere is, we'll have them, he used an expletive, voting for us for, I can't remember whether it was 50 years or 200 years. But he was devastating. But what's good about what's happening in Atlanta is when you get black entrepreneurship, black businesses, nothing gets blacks and minorities in general away from the plantation and liberal control quicker than being successful and realizing what's going on. And more, I think that Donald Trump in the coming election is going to get a larger share of the black vote, particularly the black male vote, than anyone ever had, any Republican in history ever had.
Well, any Republican since Eisenhower. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, another thing people don't know, if you ask the average person, if Lincoln was a Democrat or Republican, they all think he's a Democrat. The Democrats freed the slaves. No. The Democrats, for every bill that's been good for minorities from that day till this, have stood against it. Every last one of them, the Democrats have fought it tooth and nail. And it's been the Republicans that freed the slaves, the Republicans that brought about prosperity to the minority communities, and the Democrats have fought it because they can't control them. Once they get their own businesses and they get a life other than living on subsistence crumbs from the government, they can't be controlled.
I think that the damage done to the black community by the Democratic policies, a lot of young blacks are understanding the problem. I said in my class one day, I'll repeat that next week. We've come to the end of the show. Will, thanks very much for appearing. It was a very interesting show, and I'll call you after the show's over.
I wanted to talk about Phoenix Health Technologies, but maybe we can do that another time.
We will do that another time, Phoenix Technologies. That's your new company. Remember that name out there.
Phoenix Health
You're listening to
Technologies.
America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.